It's no secret that the world loves ships. Whether it's aircraft carriers that can fit in your pocket or battleships that can sink an entire fleet of aircraft carriers, there's just something mesmerizing about vessels that can traverse the seas. But while most of us are content to simply admire these machines from afar, one company actually got to briefly own the 6th largest navy in the world, and all they paid for it was soda. Yep, in 1989, Pepsi actually struck a trade deal with the Soviet Union that involved the USSR giving Pepsi 17 submarines, a cruiser and a destroyer in exchange for Pepsi products. It was a pretty good deal for the Soviets because at that point they were desperate for hard currency. However, Pepsi ended up with more than they bargained for. In fact, when all 19 ships were delivered to Pepsi in 1990, the company became the proud owner of the world's 6th largest navy. And they didn't even have to pay for any of it. In total, the Soviets handed over 17 submarines, 1 cruiser and 1 destroyer. The US Navy at the time had 11 aircraft carriers. So if you count the Pepsi ships, Pepsi would have ranked 6th behind the US, Russia, China, North Korea, and the UK, and ahead of countries like India and Argentina, who also have aircraft carriers. However, you may notice that this list includes a bunch of things that aren't aircraft carriers. And that's because most of Pepsi's new acquisitions were submarines. To be fair, some of these were pretty advanced for the time. For example, the 6 Oscar-class submarines that the Soviets gave to Pepsi were built in the late 1970s and early 1980s and were designed to deliver nuclear payloads to enemy targets. But then again, so was the Whiskey class, which was the first Soviet submarine to be fitted with cruise missiles. Not to mention the fact that Pepsi now owns 2 of the Akula class, which was designed to be the ultimate multi-purpose submarine. While Pepsi was given for of the Foxtrot class, which were attack submarines, as well as a Kilo-class submarine, which is basically the Russian equivalent of a jack-of-all-trades, master of none. On top of that, Pepsi also received one of the Alfieri-class cruisers, which were equipped with long-range missiles and anti-ship missiles, as well as the Moskva-class destroyer, which was one of the most modern destroyers in the Soviet Union. But despite receiving such a massive gift, Pepsi never intended to use these ships themselves. In fact, after they were briefly featured in a commercial, Pepsi promptly began to sell them off. Interestingly enough, though, they didn't make much money from this process, selling the ships for only $2 million each. Some reports indicate that they tried to get more, asking for as much as $4 million per vessel. But considering that these ships were virtually useless at that point, this wasn't much. Ultimately, Pepsi only made about $30 million from the sales, which isn't even enough to cover the cost of maintaining the ships for a single year. That being said, they did try to find creative ways to use the ships. At one point, they suggested turning the Akula-class submarines into floating casinos. But because these were nuclear-powered vessels, this proved to be too expensive. Ultimately, they were scrapped, as were the rest of the ships. But what do you think? Would you have used these ships for military purposes? How else could Pepsi have used them? Or was it simply better to scrap them? Let us know in the comments below. And as always, thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to check out the next one.